A meeting between e-hailing and taxi operators has ended with an agreement to establish an inclusive committee. The agreement comes after tension between some of the drivers recently around malls in Soweto. Violence broke out at Maponya Mall, where vehicles were set alight. Also at Protea Glen Mall. The fight there is understood to have been over passengers. Let's get the view now of Collen Msibi, spokesperson for the National Transport Department, with me in studio this afternoon. A very good evening. Well, good afternoon to you, sir. Thank you so much for coming in. So, consensus from the meeting that was held by the industry and the transport MMC, Kenigunen and Joburg, is that this all comes down to illegal operators being the problem. Is that your reading?
Well, of course, there is that perception, and thanks for the opportunity to allow us to come to the studio. There is that perception that the e-hailers, they do as they please, mainly because of the issue of the regulations. We are saying that we are of the view that there has been an interim measure in place through the practice note that was sent to the provinces to say, let them issue the operating licenses for the charter service. So we are of the view that while there would be illegal operators, which is a matter of the police in terms of how they should deal with those. But of course, without the regulations, it is a problem. So it's the matter that we're attending to as the National Department of Transport.
And who is then classified as an illegal operator to begin with in an industry, A, with so many people claiming to speak for those who work in the sector, and whenever you speak to one side, they say, well, the others are to blame?
Well, an illegal operator is basically somebody who doesn't have an operating license. If you don't have and you operate as an e-hailer, or even the minibus taxis for that matter, if you do not have the operating license, you are illegal, basically. That's how we define it. But in terms of how we enforce, that's when we say the law enforcement agencies, our traffic officers, are the ones who must then institute any any enforcement issue that has to be taken up with that particular person who's operating. So we leave it to the law enforcement to do that work. But remember, with the taxi lehotla, we are trying to introduce what we call public transport law enforcement unit. And that unit is specifically going to look at the public transport, nothing else but public transport, so that we can then enforce the regulations that we introduce.
And when you say it's the job of law enforcement to enforce the rules, am I fair to say that they've not been doing that sufficiently, and that is why, therefore, we've seen another flare-up?
Well, I think we need to be fair. The law enforcement officers cannot be everywhere. There's a number of them. So where there's been sporadic issues of violence, we call for the visibility of the police in those areas, and I think that's what they've been doing lately. So we are saying that the issue of this barbaric act of violence in the taxi industry is high on the agenda of the net joints and that of Justice Cluster. So this one specifically, it is part of it. So we've seen police being visible in the areas where there have been problems.
I get that police can't be everywhere all the time, right? But I wonder how workable, sustainable, sensible, perhaps even, a strategy it would be to only see a deployment, for example, when there has been violence, because we're hearing instances where people's vehicles have been set on fire, and that has so much potential to lead to terrible escalation. A few years ago, we were hearing of people set alight in their cars.
Indeed. I think that is, of course, there's an issue, an element of destructive competition in the industry. And which is why we've had to go to this National Taxi Lehotla to look at how we can deal with those things. And as I said, one of the resolution is that we should have this public transport law enforcement unit, which specifically looks at that. And we believe with the number from that unit, we should be able to be seen everywhere, as you are saying. But at the moment, there is crime which is not even related to the issues of public transport, but we would then expect when something happens in the public transport, the police must also be there. And sometimes it is not practical, but I think where there is issues of violence and it's reported, we then see the police being there.
Where is that public transport unit? When will it come online?
Well, there is a task team which is comprising of Santaco. We have to work with them. But remember, this must go to Cabinet as well for approval. And after that, there's going to be legislation. So we're in that process at the moment.
Could be a long wait, given how slowly things move through Parliament.
it could be a long legislative wait, which must also go to Parliament and so forth. But eventually, these things do come through the line. So we would have to be patient so that it does eventually happen.
Hard to be patient, though, when people's property is torched. Operators and customers, commuters feel unsafe, and people have died.
Well, we must remember that the e-hailing, we never expected it to be this big as government. And hence, there's been also the accusation that it has taken us too long to do the amendment on the Act.
A fair accusation?
Which is quite a fair accusation. And I've said it before, we are the first to admit that it has taken too long. So what I am then saying to you is that the industry has gone so big. This issue of e-hailing is not just somebody who's owning it or government. It's out there. It's on the phones of people. If you were to stop it, you have to confiscate people's phones. It is out there. So therefore, we have to move with the times as government. And hence we are saying that we've had to come up with this particular resolution. And the unit must be a reality. And we are saying that, of course, we can't jump the gun and say, tomorrow the unit is now operational. We have to go through the process. Otherwise, we're going to be challenged and we're going to go to court.
So at this point, it's up to let's say, in Johannesburg, JMPD and the SAPs to keep people safe.
Exactly.
But they don't have enough numbers. So what?
They don't have enough numbers. We've also got, of course, the NTP, National Traffic Police. They are also assisting. But we are saying that the numbers are not there. Where there is issues, burning issues, of course, the deployment by the police, you would see it there. But as we are saying, they cannot be everywhere on a daily basis.
I want to talk about the issue of regulation. The conversation around regulating the e-hailing sector has been going on not just in South Africa, but the world over, right? Unfair competition is what the traditional taxi operators would say is what e-hailing has over them. In South Africa, we've been talking, as you were just referencing, at ways to try and to regulate the space. It exists on apps. The owners of some of these companies are not even in the country. Can you regulate it?
Well, in terms of the app, we are obviously calling for ICASA. I think they're going to be approached because that is the technology that is being used. As a Department of Transport, we don't have that capacity. So the issue of the app on its own requires ICASA to be part of the regulation so that they can advise and tell us what we need to do. But when it comes to the regulation of the industry itself, it falls within our purview. So that's the issue we're dealing with. We have to look at the standards that we need to set. And as far as the vehicles that needs to be utilized, we need to look at the requirements in terms of the applications that must be submitted, so that when we approve these operational licenses, we need to set up those requirements. But also the issue of, as you've said, the issue of illegal operators. How do we then classify what is an offense? How much are they supposed to pay when the offense has been committed? If we are found to be illegally operating, what is it? What is the punishment that goes with that? So these are all the issues. But what we cannot do, which I think I've heard it so many times, that we need to regulate the prices. We cannot do that. The prices are good for the consumers. There has to be competition. But secondly, once you set up the price, you are on a collision course with the Competition Commission Act. So we therefore cannot go into those uncharted waters.
It's also going, though, this battle into what has happened within the minibus space especially. It sounds similar to that when there are fights over routes, right? For example, in Johannesburg at the moment and in other metros, there's a fight over, for example, Uber or Bolt operators allowed to pick up and drop off people at train stations? Are they allowed, for example, to operate within a mall space? In fact, they said here from the meeting in Johannesburg that e-hailing drivers will be allowed to make pickups or drop off only outside malls in Soweto, as well as shopping centres. So you would have to come up with legislation, am I right, that could even regulate that?
Yes, the regulations is about that. But remember, it's going to be difficult to assign routes for e-hailing, because we can only say, you, Tembegile, are going to start from this point. But as to where you then go, because that depends on the consumer. If the user say, I want to go to Sun City from Johannesburg, how do we then regulate where you're going to go? So that is why we're saying the industry must move with the times.
Sounds to me like e-hailing has got ahead of you as government in terms of what you can do to control and manage it.
You see, that's the issue, that when you have to go through the legislation, you're going to be overtaken by events. But as I said, there's been an interim measure where we've put in place the practice note to the provinces to say, at least for now, use this particular mechanism to regulate while we wait for the bigger amendment bill to be passed. But remember that we're not just sitting and waiting for the bill to be passed. The regulations are being developed as we speak. So we're not going to say once it's passed and then we say, oh, let's start now and do the regulations. So that has started, but once it's passed, we're then going to start with the consultation process with the industry and the public in general.
Collen Msibi, a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you so much for coming in as always. Spokesperson for the Transport Department.